What I do to build muscle is different from what I do to stay super lean. I make slight, very subtle shifts to my diet when I go into a main gaining or sort of a lean bulking phase. Now it happens in a way that you might not ever notice because I am always in this sort of micro bulk and micro cut phase. One thing that I want to make abundantly clear before I get into the foods. First, these are my foods, my opinion, right? So although it's rooted in science, I have found reasons why they work for me. So although we could pick them apart in certain ways, this is what's worked for me and it's worked very, very well. Secondly, there is a hierarchy you have to remember. First and foremost, and I've talked about this before, stimulation is number one for building muscle. If you can't get enough protein, that's a bummer, but stimulation is going to be the best thing possible for muscle protein synthesis because then the protein is going to be allocated for muscle protein synthesis because there's a demand, okay? So stimulus first, protein second, calories third. But all that being said, calories matter. More calories is going to create a more favorable environment for building muscle, and that's just the way it is. The third thing I want to make sure is clear is that although I have some foods that are higher calorie foods, I generally do not mix fats and carbs together. And the reason that I say that is because there is enough evidence for me to not do so. And that's simply because the evidence suggests that maybe there's this thing called metabolic gridlock. Maybe there's a thing called the Randall cycle. Maybe our mitochondria prefer one fuel source at a time. And I try to look at things from sort of an evolutionary standpoint, like what have we eaten over thousands and thousands of years? And it was probably not too common that we would raid a beehive and also have a fatty cut of meat. It's probably just what we had available. So with all that, let's jump right into the foods. First one is no surprise. As lean as possible meat as you can get. Why do I say that? Again, I want lean meats because I want to be able to control the other variables. I've said this many times before, but if I'm looking at 2 burger patties or 2 ribeyes and I can't really tell the difference between the two, there's still a chance that one ribeye might have 15 grams more fat than the other ribeye, and I can't even tell by looking at it. That 15 gram of fat change is a pretty significant amount of calories, right? Like we're talking 140-ish or so calories, 135. That's a lot when it adds up, right? Okay, so bottom line is I go with lean meats. It's just the way that I function with it. The second thing is I have a heck of a lot more whey concentrate coming into my life. Whey protein concentrate is a staple for me either way, but the simple change when I go from being in more of a cut or maintenance mode to being in a bulk mode is I go from 1 shake all the way up to 2, sometimes 3. It sounds funny, it sounds lame, it sounds like a not very Thomas DeLauer thing to do, but it becomes about simple numbers at that point. How do I get more protein without huge amounts of calories? Sure, I want to get my calories up, but I want to get my calories up in a way that is strategic and is well varied in terms of the types of fats that I get. So it's easier to control the variable of protein by just adding more shakes in. And I don't have to increase the calories that much. So yes, I use good quality ones. I don't use garbage. That's just the way it is. While we're on the tone of supplements, I do tweak my supplementation a tiny bit when I'm bulking. What I do add in is I add more creatine, I add more taurine, and I add more TMG, also known as betaine or trimethylglycine. Those are the 3 things that I increase more. Now, if you want to see me do a specific video on the supplements that I use when I'm in a muscle building mode, please comment down below. The way that I get my creatine in is I use one that is from Create called a Creatine Daily Performance Gummy. They have a different one now. So this is one that also has a multivitamin mixed in with it. So Create now has a multivitamin gummy that is 0 sugar now. They've changed their formula. It's 0 goose egg sugar. Okay, so this has a multivitamin in it. It has a low dose of creatine in it, and it has adaptogenic mushrooms in it, and it has a couple greens in it. So it's pretty darn potent when it comes down to just covering all the bases. So that link down below is for 50% off if you want to try it out. And it's a low dose creatine, exactly what I like. So what I'll do is I'll use the creatine, like Create multivitamin gummy, and then I'll also add the creatine gummy later on throughout the day too, because I low dose creatine multiple times throughout the day so that it simulates a more anabolic environment by having more creatine coming in. Even though it's about the stores, I do think that having it coming in consistently is going to keep water retention a bit lower. Not a lot of evidence to back it up, but it's my own personal anecdotal experience. So these new daily performance gummies are really unique because they put an emphasis on creatine too. So that link is down below. Highly recommend you check them out. Give them a shot. 0 sugar too. Number 3, I start getting more of my fats in the way of macadamia nut butter. It's expensive, but you don't need much. Okay, if I have 1 tablespoon of this stuff, I'm getting a decent amount of calories. I used to use almond butter. I've found over the years that I don't feel good with almond butter. Like, it does something to me. I don't know, I don't think it's the oxalates, because I think that's a more long-term thing. Maybe it's the phytates, but I think that when I consume almond butter, I consumed so much when I was doing low carb that I think I have an intolerance to it. I retain water, I don't feel good, my joints hurt. Macadamia nut butter, you've got a higher monounsaturated fat content, and you're getting other benefits there independent of what you would get out of like almond butter. So macadamia nut butter becomes a big like kind of bulking, lean bulk staple for me. Number 4, in a similar fashion, I eat a lot of hummus. So I'm not a fan of just guzzling olive oil like I used to when I was like putting mass on. I'm much more of a fan of like putting it into a more functional food. So we'll make baba ganoush, or I'll buy baba ganoush, or I'll just make my own hummus. And I've talked about this is also a fat loss staple for me, but when I'm bulking, I just have more of it. So chickpeas, salt, pesto that I make with olive oil, and of course olive oil. Sometimes I'll mix sesame seeds in, like a tahini, and maybe some other spices, and that's it. That's all it takes to make hummus. Maybe a little lemon juice, and it's a very like somewhat calorically dense food with a high amount of fiber, and I'm getting all the right fats, not getting the ones from, I don't know, like processed garbage. Number 5, I'll have gluten-free sourdough bread. Why? Because it's the time that I can. Good quality homemade sourdough is not the same as regular bread. I have done detailed videos on this. These videos were very popular because it's a very important thing. I'm gonna cut to a 1-minute reel that I did on sourdough and how it's different from regular bread.
Sourdough is not the same as regular bread that you get from a grocery store. The fermentation process changes a lot of things. Now look, if you're watching your carbs, the carbs are carbs, bottom line. But the fermentation process changes the acidity level, which actually changes some of what is called saccharification. So it changes how these starches break down. Also, type 2 fermentation, which is common when you're fermenting sourdough, changes some of the starches to what's called a resistant starch, which means it's resistant to digestion in our body. So the bacteria in our gut feed on it. It's sort of like when you have a fiber that you can't really digest. So some of the starches actually change. Now regarding the gluten, this is up for debate, but it seems as though the fermentation process may alter the surface structure of the gliadin, the alpha gliadin and the gamma gliadin, which is what would typically react with people that have a gluten intolerance. Does this mean that you can go and eat all the sourdough bread you want if you have a gluten intolerance or celiac? No, but it does mean that sometimes people have an easier time digesting sourdough than they would other forms of bread. Also keep in mind, the fermentation increases the level of what are called proteases, so you can digest the proteins in the bread easier. A lot of times the bloating that people get with bread is coming from the protein trying to be digested. So if you assist that with some fermentation, it might just be easier to digest.
Okay, number 6, I'll eat these new things called a David bar. I have no affiliation with this brand. Maybe I will in the future because they're awesome, but I don't right now. Peter Attia is actually part of this brand. Like 120 to 150 calories, super lean protein, very low fat. Most of the calories come from protein. There's no other protein bar on the market like it. Not something I eat every day, but it does definitely become more of a staple for me when I'm trying to add mass. Number 7, I get some carbs in the evening from Tart cherry juice. You've seen my videos talking about Tart cherry juice for sleep because it naturally contains melatonin, it helps melatonin production, but it is decently high in sugar. I mean, it's cherry juice after all. So this is the time when I'm like, you know what? Yeah, I could be more flexible and I could have it in the evening time. So what I'll do is I'll have a half a cup around dinner time. It does help me sleep, but would I call it like an anabolic food? I mean, maybe because of the carbohydrate content, it's somewhat anabolic, but it's not that anabolic. Which kind of leads me to the question, like, do carbs actually influence muscle growth? Not really. You see, carbohydrates might influence muscle growth because they definitely encourage you to eat more. Is there a mechanism in which carbohydrates increase muscle protein synthesis by maybe spiking insulin? Even then, it's negligible. People can build muscle on low carb, but the carbohydrates definitely help you eat more. Which leads me to number 8. I'm more liberal with my maple syrup and my honey. I've become more of a fan of maple syrup lately because maple syrup has such a high antioxidant profile when it's a darker, more aged maple syrup. There's even a study, and I talked about this in my foods that I use to stay lean video. The researchers literally said that the antioxidant and sort of the flavonoid profile of dark maple syrup is strong enough to cancel out or kind of counter some of the negative aspects of sugar. It doesn't counteract sugar itself, but some of the negative attributes of it. Number 9, I'm just going to glaze over, but that's eggs. Eggs are still part of my life. They always will be unless something catastrophic happens, but eggs are life. Number 10, I have smoked sockeye salmon coming back into my life a lot. If you've watched my channel for years, you know that I've gone ebbed and flowed on smoked salmon. For a while, smoked salmon was kind of getting rocky when the Norwegian salmon was having like high amounts of heavy metals and also potential radiation issues. Like it was questionable whether it was okay to have. But now we're seeing more smoked sockeye salmon, like smoked sockeye Alaskan salmon. I'm also a fan of smoked trout, right? I like lake fish because you don't have the potential risks of the heavy metals, you don't have the radiation risk as much. So you end up with a pretty good quality fish that's a high omega-3 profile, but it's also just a lean source of protein. So with this, I'll mix it in with my eggs. It's something that if I'm trying to stay super lean, I don't focus on as much because the sodium content is so high. I actually think that it blurs out my abs a little bit. Call that vain, call that kind of narcissistic or weird, but I notice it. I mean, you're talking like a couple thousand milligrams of sodium in a small serving of it. You're gonna notice that in water retention, right? And if you're trying to stay lean, the last thing you wanna do is funk with your head. Number 11, I'm a big deli meat person, but I like deli meat when it is good quality. So like we're talking Applegate Farms, like where there's just a few ingredients, or we're talking something that is, the ingredients should only say meat, salt, and maybe like 1 or 2 spices. No benzoate, no sodium phosphate, no sodium erythorbate, none of that, just clean, simple stuff. And what I'll do is I will actually put a slice of Pecorino Romano cheese, or maybe I'll even take like regular Parmesan, right? But usually it's Pecorino, or if I can get it, I'll get Pecorino Sourdough, which is the cheese that's truly out of Sardinia, not the more cultured version that they export called Pecorino Romano. It is a sheep cheese that is very high in C15 fat. So it's very beneficial, but it's also a little more calories. So I will take like Applegate Farms smoked turkey, a little bit of Pecorino, and that's a great way to get some calories and some protein in. Then the next food that's on my list is going to be lentil pasta. I don't do a ton of lentil pasta or chickpea pasta when I'm in a super fat loss phase, but if I'm leaning a little towards building muscle, that is my low glycemic kind of carb of choice. I feel like I get to have like a lot of pasta and it just feels good. I can't tell you any particular muscle building reason, but if you're trying to like base a plan off the foods that I eat, then there you go. And this last one is one that just came into my life recently, corn. I was sitting in my car at a stoplight and I was thinking about how many cultures that are really healthy with good lifespans and good BMI eat a fair bit of like fermented corn. They eat maize, right? And I started thinking, I'm like, it's like how we consume corn and we've just industrialized the ever living crap out of corn. Like maybe it's not corn that's the problem. Like, maybe it's A, the amount of corn, B, the adulteration of the corn, and C, like we're not fermenting it, we're not making it into this maize like it's done in the Aztec and the Mayan like history, right? And what turned me on to this, and this is no affiliation with them, is that brand Masa that makes like good fermented corn fried in tallow as a chip. And I'm like, that is a good wholesome food. And I'm like, wait a minute, like if you get good quality like organic corn or you get good quality maize and you like ferment it, like you soak it and you let it sort of ferment and you make your own tortillas out of it, that's actually kind of a decent carb source, right? Like it's something that we could probably consume without a huge problem. I would actually say that that's probably a little bit better than rice in my opinion. I still have sweet potatoes, I still have these other carb sources, but I'm having more corn than I did before. And I feel like it's actually providing some like almost a girth to my diet, if I can say that. Like I feel like I'm getting something a little bit more, not to mention I feel a little more well-rounded with it. And I feel like I'm not missing out and I'm able to adhere to things better. As always, keep it locked in here on my channel. I'll see you tomorrow.